Good evening, President Connolly, trustees, Dr. McLaughlin, executive team, and community. I'm here tonight to speak about Inclusive Schools Week. This is the second year that our district has celebrated Inclusive Schools Week. I want to thank this board, the previous school board, and the executive team for recognizing the importance of promoting inclusive education and of making sure that every child feels welcomed, valued, and included in our district. I know that some in our community may not yet be aware of what Inclusive Schools Week is all about. Last year, I stood at this podium and told a story about a boy from my high school who has significant disabilities and a talent for making shots from the hash mark on a basketball court. His story of finally playing in a game and having his talent respected by the opposing team illustrates the journey that people can make from awareness to acceptance to the inclusion of someone with a disability. Last year, I told a story from my past because despite the positive changes that were beginning in our district, the changes hadn't yet affected my child. This year is different. This year, the district's efforts to close the achievement gaps for all student groups, to emphasize a more inclusive approach, and to recognize that students receiving special education are everyone's responsibility. They are not those kids, but our kids, are obviously having an impact. So here's our story. My family moved to this district from a neighboring one because their overall approach for students with disabilities was not very inclusive. We did have an inclusive preschool experience, and my daughter had a few classmates with a heart for kids like her. I called those kids little mommies. There was one girl who would wait for my daughter to arrive every day. She wouldn't even go to the playground without my daughter. Another girl was constantly pulling mine into games and activities, making sure she was included. But the world doesn't usually work that way for people with disabilities. Having a disability makes you more likely to be excluded than included. Having a disability, especially an intellectual or developmental disability, makes you more likely to live in poverty, to be homeless, to be under or unemployed, or to be a victim of violence or sexual assault. For many people with disabilities, self-determination and the pursuit of happiness that so many of us take for granted is an inaccessible dream. Why is that? I learned a hard lesson during my daughter's last days in preschool. For her birthday, I decided to have a small play date rather than a big party. I invited a few kids from her class that I knew played with her on a regular basis, and not one parent replied to my invitation. Not even a polite decline. They just didn't bother to reply. It was a pretty heartbreaking experience, but not one that's uncommon for kids with disabilities or others who may be marginalized for being different. Do I think that those parents were awful human beings? No, I don't. I think that, like so many of us, they were uncomfortable with my daughter's differences and didn't know what to expect. Those social barriers exist whether we want to admit it or not, and most of us don't know how to overcome them. I want to be clear that I can't claim any moral superiority here. Before I had a child with a disability, I didn't spend much time thinking about people with disabilities. It just wasn't on my radar. I think many people just don't realize the significant impacts of exclusion or inclusion. That is why we need awareness events like Inclusive Schools Week. It gives us time as a community to think about what we are doing to make our schools and our community more inclusive for people like my daughter who might otherwise be consigned to a life on the margins. Right now in our district, the emphasis on inclusive education is creating opportunities for teachers, staff, administrators, families, and students to break down barriers and connect with one another, academically and socially. My daughter's general education teacher, Mrs. Yim, had a great idea to use the Flipgrid app for students in her class and my daughter's special education class to create and exchange getting to know you videos. You know, I like unicorns, my favorite color is purple, and my favorite spot at school is the playground. And it's working. Recently, as we were leaving school, a student I didn't know called out my daughter's name to say goodbye. It may not seem like a big deal to you, but I was completely caught off guard. My daughter doesn't typically receive shout-outs like that. My daughter's special education teacher, Ms. Raymer, visited the 4th and 5th grade classes at Maple to talk about autism, and the students have responded with openness and curiosity. A few years ago, some kids laughed at my daughter when she had a meltdown during the Maple Jog-a-thon, a loud, chaotic event. This year, I managed to coax her into running a few laps, and a boy running past us looked at her and said, "Come on, you've got this." Then Principal Lewis encouraged a group of girls to run a lap with her, and they encouraged her the whole way. Teachers and staff also shouted encouragement. It was amazing to feel so embraced by our community. Every Friday at Maple, kids participate in Mustang Mentors, a program that emphasizes social-emotional learning. Teachers have thoughtfully helped students connect with each other, including those with disabilities. Ms. Raymer recently sent me a picture of my daughter and 2 other kids from the Mustang Mentors program. All 3 were smiling happily for the camera, and my daughter was reaching out her hand to one of the girls. I haven't seen anything like this in years. Talk about overcoming barriers. Now, does this mean everything in our district is puppy dogs and sunshine with nothing left to be done for marginalized students? No, of course not. But change is happening. Maybe one day all children will feel so accepted and be so included that we won't need an inclusive schools week anymore. Wouldn't that be something to see? Thank you.